Voice work is a big part of how I differentiate my characters. Like, also, you could go into different types of accents, which I've watched. I've watched YouTube videos to kind of get the better understanding of how these kind of things kind of come out. And then there's different things with the voice, like the speed at which you talk, the pitch at which you talk. And there's kind of little other things that you could throw in there, like whistles between the
That's crazy.
And of course, when you change your voice like this, often how your face feels like if you're talking with a frown, it's going to be different than when you're talking with a smile.
Right.
Like, there's many things that you can do to influence the voice.
Okay, so I have a challenge for you. What's up, guys? Welcome to the Wolf of Young Street podcast. This week, my guest is Teni. He's a dungeon master. No, not that kind of dungeon master, guys. He's a Dungeons and Dragons dungeon master, and he's got his own YouTube channel known as Dicely channel. For all your awesome D&D content, you can connect with that channel.
Hey, Victor, thank you for having me.
Hey. All right. So I thought I'd get this out of the way because, there's a bit of an elephant in the room, right? How does it feel to fulfill a role in Dungeons and Dragons, being a dungeon master, knowing that some people might hear that and think something else?
Yeah, it's sometimes that happens. Other times people won't bring it up, but a lot of people, and also to kind of remove brand specificality to Dungeons and Dragons, because there's a lot of different tabletop role-playing games out there. Sometimes people will go by game master or storyteller. It depends on how they kind of see themselves, but in the nerd space, dungeon master probably will bring forth the gaming side as opposed to that other one, just because we're nerds.
Yeah, I'm actually curious because I think there's probably a good story there. Can you tell me of a moment where someone mistook what you did?
Thankfully, it wasn't. I don't think it's ever been a mistake. I think D&D is a bit more in the zeitgeist now these days, where people realize that that's a thing that people do. But I did recently like half a year ago, I reconnected with a friend from high school, and I told her, yeah, I do DMing, dungeon mastering. She's like, oh, really now? And I'm like, oh, come on now. And then later I found out that she did BDSM stuff, and I'm like, wait, you gave me the razz about being a dungeon master. Meanwhile, you're over here being the other type of dungeon master. I can't believe it. The audacity.
That is awesome. But I mean, we're here for D&D. Obviously, I've never played Dungeons and Dragons, and I conveyed this to you. If you were explaining Dungeons and Dragons to an absolute beginner, someone who has never had any exposure to the game, how would you describe Dungeons and Dragons?
So Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of people kind of assume it's like, yeah, so I'll start with what people usually assume it is. They think like it's just a bunch of people gather around the table. It's like kind of a board game kind of thing. And people on the outside don't exactly know what it is you do at that point, rather than, is it just some big tabletop game? That's only half right. So, and especially since the COVID pandemic, that has kind of been thrown out the window, because now a lot of people are gaming online, and that's a lot of what I do. Is I host my D&D games online. But what Dungeons and Dragons is it is run by the game master or dungeon master, and their job is to create a story or facilitate a story, a world, a bunch of characters that populate that world, and then all the other players, usually that's between 4 and 6 players, depending on how many people you are capable of shepherding, and they each come in with their own one character. So where they get to focus on their player character, you're essentially giving them space in an imagination scape to interact with things, to see the outcomes of actions they want to take. Like, and for the most part, with the exception of combat scenarios, because a lot of players will play D&D for combat elements, it's a lot of it is just role play talking. Like, okay, you walk into this room and you see there's a chandelier up above you. There's several people in the room sitting at a table having dinner. And like you flesh a room in this way, and then you go, all right, and did any of those things interest you? What would you like to do? And a player might be like, all right, well, I'll sit down at this table with these people having dinner and strike up a conversation. Maybe I'll ask them about, have you heard anything interesting going on in the area? Like any things that might lead to adventure? Because that's what a lot of Dungeons and Dragons stories is fantasy adventure. Though, mind you, there are many games that are appealing to many different genres. So I could talk about that later.
Right.
But yeah, so it is collective imagination storytelling with a GM or DM setting up scenarios and an environment, and the other players getting the opportunity to interact with these scenarios and situations.
Right. So I'd like an idea of what the gameplay is actually like. If you could just kind of give us a breakdown. Obviously, from a complete novice point of view, I know there's a bit of dice involved. That's the extent of my knowledge on the Dungeons and Dragons gameplay. So
yeah. On the gameplay side of things, yes, there are dice involved, and in many of these situations that I was talking about, for example, to create another situation, you see a wealthy-looking individual walking along, and they've got a sack hanging from their belt that very clearly you can hear the jingling of coins from within. And you go, okay, perhaps I want to cut it open with a knife and see if I can steal those coins without them noticing. The dice represent the opportunity of degrees of success and failure. Perhaps you roll the 20-sided die is the most common die in the game. Do I have one handy? I do here somewhere. So, not that it's very big, and also my camera won't focus on it, but it almost is spherical, but 20 sides on it.
Yeah.
If you roll the 1, for example, maybe it might be like, oh yeah, no, this guy hears you coming, swings around, grabs your hand, and escorts you to the authorities or whatever.
Right.
And maybe if you go on the extreme high end of the dice, you cut open the bag, the coins fall out into your hands, and you sneak away. No clue. And it might be minutes before this guy even picks up to the idea that he's been robbed. So that is what the dice facilitate in Dungeons and Dragons, is opportunities of success and failure, as well as when it comes to combat encounters, how much damage that you deal to opposing forces.
Right. So and how are the character, because you did mention that each person that comes into the game comes in as a particular character. How does that come to be?
So when you start to run a game, usually you want to have a first session where you sit down with everybody who's going to be playing and be like, all right, so what kind of story do you guys want to tell? Like, what kind of adventures are you wanting to be? And what kind of characters do you want to make? And it's in this first session usually where you'd want to help players figure out their builds, what they want to, what kind of character they want to make. And in Dungeons and Dragons, you get quite a few choices. Like, you get to choose your character's race, though that specifically does bring up a lot of ire in the community. A lot of people choose to say ancestry instead. And as well as your class, which is like your fantasy adventuring profession. Like, you could be a barbarian or a rogue. And back to the races, you could be like an elf, a dwarf. And a few of my friends, despite being quite boring to many people, just love to play humans. And it's like, you know what? I can respect that, because that means it's less of a it's like, how do I make this character interesting? I don't have this fantasy race to lean on, so now I've just got this human.
Yeah.
How do I make them interesting? So it's a fun challenge too, to just be something a bit more vanilla.
Right. So maybe give me an example of maybe your favorite Dungeons and Dragons character to play, and what some of the abilities that each character maybe can have.
Mhm. So one of my favorite classes in the game is called the cleric, which is more of a traditionally it's more of a healer support type of spell casting class. Like stereotypically, people are like, yeah, clerics, they're meant to heal the other party members and boost and buff and debuff enemies and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But this edition of Dungeons and Dragons has made the cleric the most tweakable, and also completely breaks that mold, in my opinion. Like, there's a lot of offensive capability.
Right.
You can still do the healing thing, but you are not solely responsible for that.
Yeah.
And I've had a character who was half elf, half human, named Mickey Tumblerun, and they are still one of my favorite characters to this day, and it is often an example I'll bring up. And they were a cleric of a trickster deity, so
Right.
they were more of a Loki kind of feeling character. Like,
Yeah.
they could change their appearance. They would often pull pranks on other people, and then yeah, I guess that kind of brings me to follow that up with, there's also numerical mechanics behind your character, what we call the character sheet.
Right.
So everybody has a sheet that details their own character, and you have 6 main stats, that being a character's strength, their ability to lift and push and those kind of things,
Right.
dexterity, how agile and like how fine-tuned dexterity they've got.
Yeah.
Constitution is health. Intelligence is like the wizard stat, remembering, recalling information. Wisdom is more of a like an awareness of both outside and inside oneself.
Yeah.
And then charisma, which is the persuasive or deceptive kind of stat. And based on these numbers, which using the player's handbook, which is kind of the main book to play the game, it guides you through how to assign these numbers, and hopefully your dungeon master will also be able to kind of help you along that path, because it's a lot to read, and especially for first timers.
Right. So I'm curious. Obviously you've described the fantasy world. It's very similar to a Lord of the Rings type world, is what you've described there. But I wonder what other alternative realms, worlds, campaigns you've been able to create.
Yeah, like a lot of that content within Dungeons and Dragons stuff is very heavily geared towards like fantasy settings, like Lord of the Rings. But with enough imagination, you can easily tweak that to be other things, like a wizard, for example. Let's take a fantasy wizard, and the only thing we have to change is the flavor of it. Like, we leave the game mechanics as is, but we can make it like Star Wars, for example. Wizards in D&D have this spell called Mage Hand, which you summon a little ghost hand and it can go and pick things up or whatever.
Yeah.
And you could just reflavor it to be like, all right, that's force manipulation. Like, you could maybe you pretend the hand is, instead of being ghostly, it's just not there, and you can force, pull, push, do things like that.
Right.
Or make it a bit more of a horror setting. I
Yeah.
make a character who is a cleric of the light, and I flavor them as a vampire hunter.
Ooh. Okay. So I guess where I'm curious is, and I know on your other channel, Play Dicely, you have this world you guys have created. And I'd like you to tell me about that world and how that idea came to be, actually.
So yeah, the D&D setting I've got on our channel, Play Dicely, it was one I've had in the works for quite a few years. It started as a home game with a few friends. It started off with 3 players, and by the end of it, we ended up adding more players, and I think we ended up with 6 or 7 at a point.
Right.
And yeah, it was just something that I never really saw like growing into something a bit bigger. The main premise of it being something happened in the overworld which caused everybody to kind of retreat underground, and in my case it was dragons had taken over the surface. The ground was sealed out so the dragons couldn't follow them, and essentially it was a story of like reclaiming the surface, and the players kind of focused on building a found family. One of them was a disgraced soldier. Another friend was playing as a stunted young girl with magical capabilities and a prodigy, and then a goofy little goblin who, and this player came in just wanting the flavor. My former roommate and brilliant guy always came with the strangest ideas for characters. He's like, I want to make something that's Dora the Explorer. And I'm like, are you serious? All right.
Right.
Let's figure out how to do that with the mechanics we had available. And so what ended up happening was they made a character. Like I said, they were goblins. So they were tiny little, something that gave him just, it felt right to kind of be goofy and silly and that kind of thing. And they, what started off as a silly premise became quite interesting in that we gave them the ability to like transform into like different animals and stuff with this specific elemental compound that they found. And so they were essentially like Dora the Explorer, Transformers, but also this metal was like a mercury, so it was poisoning their mind. So that's why they were like all Dora the Explorer, and just absolute absurdity. And what ended up being quite, I don't want to say traumatic, but a lot darker than the original intent was. But everyone loved it.
Yeah, I know the world has elements of like mild horror as well.
Yeah,
it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and that kind of spawned from my ask of the players. I was like, well, what do you guys want out of your game? And you know, some of them were like, yeah, we want to experience like difficult moral quandaries. And one of my players was like, I really want a horror kind of backstory for myself. And so it's like, well, because that horror exists, it's going to exist within the world itself. So it kind of is ever present, though subtle.
And obviously, you know, the game is more, D&D as a game is more focused on, just like my understanding of it is more focused on like team play, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how does it cater to the competitive side where, you know, certain people they play games because they'd like to compete? How does it cater to that?
Well, that's something that should be talked about in that first session. Like when you're asking, like, what characters do you want to play? What kind of story experience do you want? Because there are many different types of players out there. Players who are competitive like that, they might be better suited for like one shots where they're like, I want to experiment with a build and see how much damage I can do. But a player like that might not be as interested in a long spanning, what's called a D&D campaign, where like we've been playing our story for like 2 years.
What?
Yeah.
Oh.
And so, yeah, a competitive heavy player might not have the attention span to stay as one character for that amount of time. So, and it's fine to have like one shot sessions where as some people call it, like a beer and pretzel session, where everybody just gets together, builds like absurdly powerful characters, and you do like a dungeon crawl, clear the dungeon, beat the boss, get the treasure. Maybe you'll do a couple of sessions with those characters, and then everyone's like, I want to try something different. And that's totally fine. It's just at that first session, understanding what it is that everybody wants out of the game.
Right. So in that sense, there's no winning by yourself. There's only winning as a team, is what I'm trying to get at there.
Yes, very much so. It is a game that you cannot win. You either all win, or that, I don't even think that's the right way to put it. It's not about winning. It's about telling a good story, and after the game, like that, everyone going, oh, it was so cool when your character did that, or do you remember when you almost failed that persuasion check and we almost all got busted? And yeah, it's the creation of memories as opposed to winning.
Yeah. So to get more into, obviously, that what that sounds like to me is the goal of the game is not the win per se, but it's the communal feel of it. And I wonder, what is the Dungeons and Dragons community like here in Canada? Do you guys connect? Have like a Comic-Con kind of situation going on?
I mean, I'm not as well. I kind of and not. I've been involved with a group called the Dungeon Masters Roundtable, which is a collection of Dungeons and Dragons or D&D. Oh dear, DMs, Dungeon Masters from all over the world. Started by a guy named Fred Wheeler from down in New Zealand. So many of us from all over the place have had conversations about D&D and these kind of things. But in terms of like what the social community is doing, like if you've got like a game shop in your town, odds are they probably have a D&D night where an employee there will run games that are designed to allow people to just show up one night and come in with a character that they're not, I will not heavily invested in, but something a bit more flexible for people to come and go. Like maybe they're not able to make it 1 week and somebody else does show up and they're like, all right, we'll just plug and play your character in this session this time.
Right.
But yeah, those kind of things are happening in game stores all over the place, whether that's Canada or elsewhere. There are conventions. I don't know too much about those things. I'm normally more involved with my own games and my own channel.
Yeah. And maybe I want to get into the online component of the game, because I think that can take things to a different dimension. But maybe before I get into that, you mentioned there that you and your friends have been playing a particular campaign for 2 years.
Yeah.
And in my head, I'm like, yo, that's like the chess of role-playing games. Like, what the hell?
Oh, I mean, there are people who've played games for much longer. And we do ours bi-weekly, so every 2 weeks. And because we're doing it for YouTube, it's a lot easier to keep track of how many sessions we've done. I think we just finished our 63rd session for this campaign.
Whoa.
We're on a bit of a break at the moment. I've needed some time for things, but yeah, and the campaign before, which took place within the same setting, was only like 20 sessions. So this one's been going on a lot longer than its predecessor. But yeah, no, the crew was very much like, we want to tell our story, and they've fallen in love with the characters they've made. So they've been willing to, instead of rush to their final goal or whatever, they're like, we'll talk to the NPCs or non-player characters along the way. Any breadcrumbs I drop, they're like, ooh, what's that? Ooh, I'm curious. Like, they are very interested in the world that they're in, and they just keep biting on the bait that I keep putting down. So
wow,
as long as they keep enjoying it, I'll keep running it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's really what it's about, right? So I'm actually curious because it's some storytelling to keep people interested for 2 years. So I'm curious about maybe tell us the story of this particular D&D game that you guys have played for 2 years. Like, tell us what's going on, tell us about the characters, tell us what the experience has been within the world, and maybe we can get into what lays in store for them in the future.
Well, sure. So earlier I was talking about this the predecessor campaign. Dragons took over the surface, forced everybody underground, and that first intro campaign, I guess, was the story of kind of figuring out like how to get the surface back. But there was also a lot of like the elves had vanished, like where did they go? And suddenly they've returned, and they're like, okay, well, I guess they've been up to stuff while we've been hiding underground. And so alliances are made and discoveries are had, and then an army is raised and they return to the surface and fight the dragons. And so this campaign that we've been live streaming is kind of 50 years later, and society has begun to rebuild itself. Innovations have been happening. There was a large kind of crusade against dragons. So a dragon hunters guild went out and basically went and hunted down all the dragons they could find, which has had repercussions. And a villain that the players in the previous campaign hadn't finished dealing with is kind of returned. And now these new characters are having to deal with this guy suddenly returning for his revenge, whatever that might be.
Who's the villain in the game?
If my players watch this will be funny for them. I love to kind of twist their heads and make them double guess on themselves. But the villain, as it currently stands, is a guy named Kardrak Mithril-Coat, which is, as the players have at this point found, he is a dwarven old guy. Like I said, he was a villain in the last campaign, but he wasn't like the main villain.
Yeah.
And essentially the civilization that lived underground, he was like, I'm loving it here. Like, things are great for me. I want to keep this. And so he was opposed to like the going to retake the surface. And like a huge chunk of that population went and fought that war. And he kind of like built walls up around that place that he had underground, and nobody heard from him in 50 years. And now he's back and seems to be trying to topple the society that people have rebuilt on the surface by kind of spouting like propaganda against the ascendancy, is the name of the kind of empire that has been set up.
Yeah.
And he's like persuading people into like seeing like things aren't good up here, and like you're being manipulated and used, and appealing to kind of the much more grassroots kind of people, and manipulating them in a way. And so yeah, he's very much been a behind the scenes, but his name is out there and people know he's doing things, but the common folk kind of can't pick up on it.
Oh, interesting. So the villain is not actually like out there. It's not. It hasn't come to the fore yet. He's just influencing things at the moment in the state of play. And what do the character, the heroes, if you like, of the story, what do they, how do they understand the situation right now? What's their standing?
So only one of the characters has met this guy face to face, and this was in like our 7th session of this campaign. Like they infiltrated a secret meeting in this farming community, and they're like, okay, so like some sort of rebellion is being planned or whatever. They infiltrate this place, and this guy reveals himself, and he's like, well, you clearly don't belong here. And he very well could have killed them, but he did not. Instead, like a raid happened on this place. He escaped. All these people that were planning this rebellion, whatever, a bunch of them were captured. And yes, only up to this point, we're now like 63 sessions of this game, that character is the only one who's met them face to face. Since then, he's been kind of winning over the common folk. He's now the mayor of one of these towns. There's suspicions that he's like smuggling illicit goods / the players are aware because they tried to stop some of this.
Right.
It's this metal that was driving one of the characters crazy in the first game. This is the material he's smuggling, and basically, like, if anybody touches it, it'll turn this metallic statue. So it's a very dangerous weapon. There's suspicions of like him kind of taking prominent people and replacing their brains with these monsters that he can control. And so that was a huge chapter. The players are like, I don't even know how to deal with this. Like,
that is wild.
Terrifying. Like, how do we know? It could be anybody.
That is crazy.
Oh gosh. And then the most recent thing that they've discovered is this guy seems to be like, he's accumulated allies and resources and stuff, and now seems to have the ability to like rip up chunks of land and just like teleport them somewhere else and drop them.
Oh,
and
what the hell?
he tested it on one of the players' home villages, and they're like, okay, it's starting to get real personal.
Yeah. The way you've described the story, I don't know if I was playing the game, here's the way I would see it. It's obviously gonna be players versus the dungeon master, because pardon my language there, it sounds to me like the dungeon master is just trying to fuck everybody up.
Well, it is and it isn't in a way. Like, it never should be like from a dungeon master side, like it's me versus the players, because that does become very antagonistic. I have to be sure, like, I ask the players, like, what are you okay with in terms of like experience in the game? Like, would you prefer that nothing bad happens to you, like NPCs that are close to your character, or like essentially I try and figure out where the line is and how to not cross it. I don't play from I'm trying to beat the players, but rather I control so many characters that not all of them are going to be allies. Not all of them are just going to be, gags. Some of them have a really bad agenda, and I have to kind of understand how they're going to go about their goals. And yeah, so sometimes I have to be put in the mind of the villain to be like, I need to be a threat. But also, conflict is how story happens.
Yeah, and for me, it's just, how do you balance because we all love that story. When you watch a movie, we all love that story of the heroes going through travails, and without the suffering, the success doesn't feel as good, right? So, or maybe some people might beg to disagree with that. It'll be like, just give me the success all the time. But my point here is, as a dungeon master, how do you balance that, the amount of suffering you're going to put the characters through before they reach their end goal? Obviously, there's the enjoyment aspect. You want everybody to be enjoying themselves, but, and more so, I'm curious, have you ever played like a no holds barred where the characters were just like, you know what, we're in your hands, dungeon master, do whatever you want with us, and we're gonna band together as a team, and just a game where you were probably the super villain in the game and just put them through the ringer?
Well, in a way, this kind of is that game for me, I suppose. Like, a lot, the conversations that happened before the campaign, the players were like comfortable with a lot of things off the hop. So it was like, all right, so, and I can kind of approach this from like, all right, so if you guys are okay with a lot of things, I'll test the waters. And then after each session, we usually have a conversation to be like, okay, how'd you guys feel about that campaign or that session? How'd that go? What did you think about this?
Yeah.
And I get immediate feedback. So like, sometimes a player will be like, I didn't know I was not comfortable with this, so and I'll be like, all right, I'll take that into consideration in the future. But we also have like, safeguards for in the moment. Like if a player's not comfortable with something, they could just nope, let's fade to black or whatever for that scene. And I'll go, all right, I'll make a note of that's not okay. And we'll make sure that doesn't happen again.
Wow.
Yeah, there are safeties in place because it can be quite a heavy thing, especially if you're very heavily invested in your character. It can almost feel like, depending on the relationship between yourself and the players, sometimes it might feel a little personal. Like, oh, I don't know, it felt like you might have been targeting me a lot more in that fight. And so it's important to keep the communication open and get that feedback after each session, I think, to ensure that everybody's okay and that you're not doing anything that's harmful to the players as opposed to the characters.
Right. Oh wow. that's like, I can just imagine what that's like, and it sounds wild to me. And I'm curious about like the NPCs, the non-playable characters in the game, and how obviously my imagination here is maybe the NPCs affect the game by maybe giving information, or how do you use NPCs?
So I've listened to quite a few different dungeon masters talk about these kinds of topics, and not only in dungeon masters but also in authors, storytellers, you can kind of get a sense of how non-player characters or non-main characters can be used as kind of plot devices. If the players aren't exactly sure where to go next, maybe an ally that you've introduced before like reaches out to them and is like, hey, I've heard something was going on in this region, or somebody has cited this kind of thing off in the east, or what have you. Kind of laying those breadcrumbs again. So it's like, all right, so they can introduce a point of interest. An NPC could also act as a guide. Like if yet another plot device. All right, you guys are heading to the swamps of the decay or whatever, and it's like, but nobody's been able to navigate it, with the exception of this one person whom you're going to have to talk to and persuade them to take you through the swamp. So they could be used as points of interest, guides, mentors. Like if a piece of information the players need, there happens to be a wizard that they've made friends with, and they're like, yes, give me a few days and I'll see what I can find in my books. And a few days might pass and you allow the players some downtime where it's just like they go and buy things, they rest up, and you allow these moments of quiet amidst all the adventuring. Because if everything's too high paced all the time, it's very tiring, despite we're not actually going out into the woods and killing dragons or whatever. Mentally it could be very exhausting. So there are downtimes. NPCs, of course, like I already mentioned, villains, antagonists, rivals. You kind of, and these are each three different things. So villains are just, this is a term that people kind of have quarrel with, I suppose, in that villains are like the irredeemable, like just absolute evil. Like some people think villain means antagonist, where antagonist has a goal and they know how they want to get to that goal, and it seems to be opposed to what the players want. It might not inherently be evil, but maybe the method is not exactly good. And a lot of times it's an antagonist that we're going to be using as opposed to a villain, though there are still places for villains. And then, of course, there are rivals, which is more of a mundane antagonist. Like, they're not out there to ruin your day or whatever, but they will, or they'll push you to be better because I don't know, maybe you have some spite towards them, or they just keep beating you in a competition each time you guys meet up and that kind of thing. And it's like, ooh, I now have the motivation to get better than that guy.
Yeah. You know, I as you were speaking there and kind of getting into character a little bit, I kind of, it made me curious about, like, is there elements of, like, you know, do you encourage characters to really, you know, like the players to get into character, maybe, you know, do a voice like you did there, which I actually really find that nice, by the way, real funny. Imagine, like, I can just imagine people playing the game and, you know, they actually do the voice, they actually mime the stuff that they're trying to do and all of that stuff. Do you ever get into, like, you know, improv or almost like, you know, demonstration in that way? Is that ever part of the gameplay?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Not every player is comfortable with going that far. And it's kind of a thing that, you know, you start by sticking a toe in the water and see how it goes, you know, get a little braver each time. And especially if it's like a group that you're playing with that you're not like all familiar with each other at first, it might come about in time as you become a little more trusting, kind of get the feel of the group. And like I myself, I've been GMing for I think more than a decade now, and it's a skill that I've definitely needed to develop over time, and have kind of honed and become more comfortable with. Voice work is a big part of how I differentiate my characters. Like also, you could go into different types of accents, which I've watched. I've watched YouTube videos to kind of get the better understanding of how these kind of things kind of come out. And then there's different things with the voice, like the speed at which you talk, the pitch at which you talk. And there's kind of little other things that you can throw in there, like whistles between the three.
That's crazy.
And of course, when you change your voice like this, often how your face feels like if you're talking with a frown, it's going to be different than when you're talking with a smile.
Right.
Like there's many things that you can do to influence the voice.
Right.
And yeah, just simple things like this. And even like if you're like, I'm going to have to raise my chair in order to better show this, but like if you're an old character, you could like hunch forward, and that immediately kind of has an influence on you overall and how your voice sounds. Or if to lower my chair again, or if you're like a big strong guy, you like puff out your chest, and it's like, yes, now I am the and showing these things as the game master. You're kind of the lead by example in a way. It's like if players see you're having fun that way and they enjoy it, like they enjoy seeing you do that, they're like, oh, maybe I'll give that a try for myself. It's a little different for them because they're only ever going to be the one character, whereas with the game master, you're able to, like, I'm a little bird in one scene, and in the next one I am the dragon. So it's a lot of fun as the game master.
It looks like a lot of fun. Yeah, it looks like you enjoy it. Maybe a bit too much, actually. No, that's so great. No, I love your voice work there.
Thank you.
So when you, to be honest, I think of this and I wonder, have you ever done like GMing for like kids, like a kids party?
I haven't played D&D with kids, but there are many players out there who had me as their first GM. So it's definitely something I'm experienced with, is introducing people to the game.
Yeah.
And even on my YouTube channel, Dicely, which isn't so active anymore since Play Dicely, the campaign that we're actually live streaming.
Yeah.
But that first channel is more geared to, you want to play but don't know how, watch our intro series and I'll take you through how to do it.
Right. So I actually, is there a way, and I'm just trying to pick your brain on this here, but is there a way to adapt, like, obviously instead of having people sitting in a room, is there a way to move this game outdoors? Has anybody ever done that, where you play Dungeons and Dragons, but it's out in the world. Maybe you've got communication devices, but you as a dungeon, as the GM, you're sitting in a room in the control tower telling people what might go down, and they're interacting, in the actual world, almost like an Amazing Race kind of situation going on.
Well, prepare to have your mind blown, because yes,
All right.
there is such a thing. I have not done it, but it's called LARPing, which is live action role play, where like a bunch of people will go out into the woods in costume, usually organized by a bunch of people, as far as I understand it. Like I said, I haven't done it myself.
Yeah.
But they'll like set up like quests, and some of them will be NPCs, and like people will have to go to these organizers, and they'll be like, yeah, so I heard there's a bear off in that direction, go fight the bear. And like, of course, people aren't fighting with actual like weapons to hurt each other.
Yeah.
But usually, like, I think there will like kind of be like referees there to be like, all right, you slayed them, go yonder that way to level up.
Yeah.
I'm not fully certain of how the LARPing community works, but there is an equivalent to that.
Interesting. The other dimension of that, especially with AI and some of the text to video technology and all that, is there's an opportunity there for you to actually, develop these stories and make them into, like, actually create the situations. Like, if a dragon is actually breathing, you could create like the scene, and people can actually, almost be there, have the experience. And I wonder if that's the other dimension I was hoping to understand. Has anybody gotten into creating those kinds of interactions?
Interesting. I'm not aware of any augmented reality or AR D&D experiences like that, but I think you're absolutely right. I think there could be, like, there's definitely something there to, like, yeah. I don't know, you can go outside, whip out your phone, and kind of like Pokemon Go. It's like, all right, your quest says you have to go here, and suddenly, oh, dragon.
Yeah, something like that. I just think there's maybe, and I wonder what you think of the opportunities for technology in improving D&D gameplay, like other aspects of D&D that could also be improved with technology.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that has come about from like the fact we've had to isolate during the pandemic. There's a website that our game uses called Roll20, where it basically acts as a simulator for a tabletop, where I, as the game master, can set up maps. So for like my combat encounters, like I have individual tokens for each player, so they can move around the board as needed. So that kind of branches we're not able to all get together. All my players all live in Toronto, and I live like 2 hours away from them, so we wouldn't be able to do this without the tech. So there are things like that. Character sheets you don't have to print off on paper anymore. Like, there are character sheets on websites like D&D Beyond. You can build your character sheets in there, and it kind of guides you through and does a lot of the number crunching on their end. So very helpful. There's plenty of room for technology to kind of improve this, though I don't know too much in how they would kind of translate that into like that AR kind of field we were talking about.
Right. So I'll give you an example of Call of Duty, right? Call of Duty has this idea, and I think it's a really cool idea, where people can collaborate and win as a team, but there's also the element of competition in the sense that you're competing against other teams. Is that element built in? Is it possible to build, or has that been built into D&D in certain campaigns?
I think that's, I wouldn't say it's like built in necessarily, but it's definitely something you could, as a game master, kind of facilitate. A big part of the job is, in addition to being like the lead storyteller and creator of the setting, there's also a big element of game design that we have to do, not to deter anybody because they think they need to like, you know, be able to design video games. Not quite like that.
Right.
But in D&D, a lot of the rules are up for interpretation. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, here are the rules. You could choose to ignore the ones that don't work for your group. So, like, let's say no magic, no classes that use magic, don't choose them. And again, that's kind of like I asked the players, are you down with this kind of exploration of the game?
Right.
So that's kind of what I mean by having to be a game designer in some sense. You get to pick and choose the rules or alter them as you need. So there could be a way that, like, say, depending on damage dealt in the game, maybe you were able to track how much experience the players get, and somebody could be a much higher level than one of the other players, or if a player misses a session, so not everyone's not leveling up at the same time, or I don't know. It kind of be up to the dungeon master to try and figure out how to facilitate that, and how the players want that to kind of take shape.
So obviously there are sort of other role-playing games, and I wonder where you place D&D relative to some of the other role-playing games. Maybe give us some examples of games that you consider on par, or if you do consider them better, let us know and give us reasons why. But I'm curious about what you think.
So D&D, what it has going for it is the name recognition. Like, everybody, at least in most circles these days, if you talk about role-playing or tabletop role-playing games, they'll probably think of Dungeons and Dragons, because at this point it's kind of thanks to community, Stranger Things, like, the name recognition has been brought back in the media,
right? And the movie, of course.
And the movie, yeah, that's right. Honor Among Thieves. I did forget about that. It was a good movie. But there are games for other genres. Like, for horror, there's Call of Cthulhu, which is more of a all the characters will probably die, so don't get too attached to them. Because that's just the nature of those kind of stories with Call of Cthulhu anyway. It's like existential horror. Everybody goes mad. Maybe a player gets kicked out of a car while they're running away from some cosmic monster.
Wow.
Craziness happens. There's things like Shadowrun, which is more of a fantasy meets sci-fi, like alternate future, where there are like humans have turned into elves and orcs and dwarves, and dragons rule these mega corporations, and you're able to upgrade yourself with like tech and, I don't know, X-ray vision, and there's all kinds of strange games that have a foundation to the kind of flavor that you might want. Pathfinder is another popular fantasy game, which is kind of the competitor to D&D.
Right.
But most of its assets are pretty much free. So, like, anybody who kind of wants to get into it, Pathfinder's got their websites that kind of prevent you from spending money. And you only really spend money on the books if you want to give them money. Oh gosh. And most big IPs these days now have made tabletop role-playing game rules for them. Like Lord of the Rings has a tabletop role-playing game. The Avatar: The Last Airbender, for example. So like there's Avatar, there's Star Wars, Marvel superheroes. They have their own rules and games, and you can make your own characters to fit into these worlds, and you can just explore these spaces. It's really cool, really fun. In terms of what I think is like good, all of those that I've mentioned, they're all good. It really, I would say, the game is what you make it. it's hard to say if like something's good or not.
Mm.
Sometimes things just aren't for everybody.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I have a challenge for you.
Okay.
And as we kind of come to the end slowly here, I'm thinking the challenge here. I'd like for you to design a game based on the concept of Dungeons and Dragons, but I wanted to take it away from the conventional fantasy setting and put it more in something different. I think I'll go for you have a bunch of people. Their goal is sinister. Their goal is something bad. Say, I don't know, they're trying to take over America.
Okay.
They're trying to take over the United States, and they have bad intentions. Like they, think of they're trying to wipe everybody's mind and turn everybody into they're implanting aliens into the back of people's heads. How about that? Not your conventional alien, different sort of alien we're talking about.
Right. So interesting. So this is, to me, what I get out of this is because when I'm thinking about designing a tabletop role-playing experience, I kind of want to be as general as I can.
Mm-hmm.
And like, for example, I want to facilitate that experience you want to do. So I'll probably go a couple steps back and be like, all right, let's make a tabletop role-playing system based on how to take over a territory, and
Right.
the players get to be this force of villains, so to say, or they get to be the antagonists.
Right.
So I'll be like, okay, you as a party or group, like, what is your goal? And we want to take this over. All right, via what method? Okay, via aliens in the back of the heads. Okay, so I'm going to need to come up with some sort of system for being like, okay, what are different options and routes that players can go to facilitate a takeover of an area?
Yeah.
All right. Well, we have the alien route. We have a route of military, of propaganda and slander. And I could come up with a whole bunch of things, and I can try and figure out.
What I'm thinking, what I had in mind here was, you imagine, however, and I'll try and play one of the characters in the story. And maybe, obviously nothing too long, but we could go through kind of the story as you imagine it. And what I'm trying to get at here is how you come up with a storyline and how me as a character can interact with the story that you've come up with. Obviously, I'm putting you on the spot here, so the level of detail to which I you can go through, I admit it might not be as detailed as you would if I gave you more time, but it's a challenge after all.
Yeah, that's fair. So if I'm to take this correctly, so it's like using the D&D rules, but this is the story we're going to be making.
Yeah, it's an alternative reality. Yeah.
Okay, understood. All right. So,
see, I'm enjoying my villain side. Right? Put you on the spot there.
yeah, it is I'm not the best at improvisation, so it is definitely a challenge. Okay, so tell me about this character that you've come up with. Like,
Okay.
I know what your goal is, but tell me about this person.
Okay, so he's the first person. So a bunch of aliens arrived on the planet. Maybe they arrived in a small pod, and he was the first. He's got the alien chip on the back of his head already, so he's basically an alien. He's not the person anymore, and he is a highly placed politician. And all what he's trying to do is influence policy, influence, steal the election, if you like.
It's a little close to home.
I know, right? The way I'm kind of thinking about it is the environment that you're going to create is going to try and stop me. You're going to maybe you create heroes that will try and stop me. But my goal as a team, with my team is to, just try and take over.
All right. So I suppose in this scenario, you guys are playing a evil party, so to say.
Yeah.
I would still want to try and figure out like, okay, there's got to be conflict in the story. So I would create probably a faction that maybe like an Area 51 kind of faction that's like, we've had reports that aliens have in fact landed in this. And of course, they're trying to make sure that public information isn't getting out.
Yeah.
But maybe that's a tactic that your team would want to use is like, no, we'll just tell everybody. Or we'll spread misinformation about it.
Yeah.
So these guys are trying to, you kind of have a timeline, so to say, in that this enemy faction, this Area 51 faction, is like, okay, people are finding out about these alien reports that we've been hearing about. Now we have to figure out who's doing this. So you guys are kind of under the radar for now.
Yeah.
And you ideally would like to maintain that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, okay, I'd set you guys up with an adventure on like finding a information broker. And you guys will have to like interview a bunch of people or maybe rough up some people who know where to find this person.
Right.
Meanwhile, trying to remain off the grid, unnoticed, like by authorities. And so through these possible threads, it's like, okay, eventually, whether that's through interrogation or that more violent approach, find out where this guy is. Okay, so now your party goes to meet them. Maybe they're in a place that's very difficult to get to, like up in a mountain. Okay, you guys are going to need to go to a store and get yourselves all geared up. It might be a dangerous journey, so like maybe you guys will be having to do some climbing at some point. Maybe there's some dice rolling to see, I don't know, maybe one of you isn't that great at climbing, and this causes a scenario that...
Don't you notice aliens are terrible at climbing? Come on.
They're so reliant on their spaceships.
I know, right?
Yeah, so there might be like a part of the story where it's like the journey to, maybe a character falls and they almost die. I don't know, whoever.
Right.
And eventually you guys get to this information broker and he's like, okay, I can kind of broadcast this out for you while maintaining a low profile and get the heat off of you. But what are you going to do for me? And then there's this like, maybe it's a social encounter where you have to then begin a negotiation, like kind of maintaining what are we going to do for this guy? Maybe he has another quest for you. It's like, if you guys do this for me, I'll keep up my end of the bargain. Meanwhile, maybe this enemy faction, this Area 51 faction, is like, we know that whoever's been doing this was in this town recently. What were they doing there? And maybe word gets to you players, and it's like, ooh, they're getting hot on our tail. What are we going to do about it? You could, of course, get the hell out of there and as far away as you can. Or maybe you're like, let's get the jump on them. Let's ambush them and kill this troop. And then headquarters will be like, well, we haven't heard from that team in a while. And so if you manage to kill those guys, that'll kind of set them back because they'll have to then investigate this place and be like, okay, well, what killed the people that we sent out here to do? Something bigger must be happening in this area. So there's a lot of, and this is like, I visualize this is like the low levels of this story.
Yeah.
Once we get to the high end, it's like, oh yeah, the information broker is your ally. You've got allies in many other places.
Yeah.
And now officially you guys are like in the main political cabinet. Yeah. And a lot of political intrigue at this point. Yeah. Like, okay, some policies are being set and it doesn't work for the party, for you guys. And so it's like, okay, we're going to organize a meeting with this guy. And so maybe you have to persuade them to take time out of their busy schedule to meet with you one-on-one.
Right.
And if you succeed in that, that gives you the opportunity to meet with them one-on-one and perhaps try and implant them with the alien.
No, that's so. I mean, what I was really trying to get at with that challenge for you was just to kind of probe the adaptability of well, not just the dungeon master. Obviously, I did test your adaptability a bit there, and you came through really nicely, really
Yeah,
nicely.
that is the pun of the name.
um, but really, you know, I've always been curious about. Obviously, there's a lot of storytelling involved, and part of storytelling sometimes is being able to kind of swing it around. And one of the stories I've enjoyed, it's not so recent anymore, but the story of like the Joker, you
Mm.
know, was a for me was a refreshing retake on the Batman story, right? And just telling the story from the perspective of the villain a little bit. I saw that as kind of an opportunity with D&D in the sense that, you know, maybe these people are not heroes. Maybe the world, the dungeon master, the mind behind is actually trying to stop them. You know, that might be an interesting direction for a D&D campaign. You know,
Yeah, and I think this challenge you presented me um, actually kind of puts you in the correct place to start being a game master. Like the fact that you had these questions, it was like it's almost like you were planning out the world ready
yeah.
for me to play in it.
Well, yeah, I'm a bit of a storyteller, but I will tell you though that the description I gave you is actually based loosely on a story I read a long time ago. So there's actually a book where, you know, there's a whole, you know, aliens invade the earth, they start implanting people, and then the residuals of the human community is driven underground. I'll put the book up if I remember what it was called now. It's been a while. But the remnants of the human settlement is driven underground, and then at some point the underground, you know, the aliens are obviously looking for this underground community, but at some point the underground community gets infiltrated by one of the aliens, and then, you know, somehow the aliens gain some empathy for them and kind of joins their cause and sort of helps them, you know, get food and water and sustenance to stay alive. Is kind of the way that story went. But I just kind of did a few tweaks to the story. So yeah.
Well, and that's another one of the big rules of Dungeons and Dragons is, or not even Dungeons and Dragons, but being a game master is steal inspiration from everywhere.
Like,
Unless, of course, you're streaming your games, at which point you have to be a little more not so, you know, taking advantage of other people's creative IP and stealing
yeah,
their ideas. But
yeah,
if it's like for your own home games, absolutely steal from your favorite media and fashion your own story from your own take based on something that you love.
yeah. Yeah. So obviously, I'd like for people to connect with the community that you're building on the Dicely channel and on Play Dicely. So I've already kind of mentioned the names there, and I'm gonna whack those up there. But were there any other things you would like for people to know?
Um, I mean, if you're gonna play tabletop role playing games, be kind to each other, be understanding. Remember, it's all about the team. If if all of you don't win, none of you win. And tropes are tropes for a reason. Don't let people tell you that your character is like, oh yeah, that's just I don't know, Master Chief from Halo's story. Well, because you're you and you're not the creator of Master Chief, it's going to be a different story because you're not them. You are a different creative person.
Right. Oh well. Thank you so much. I can. Your passion for the NDO comes through, and you know, I'm gonna remember, you know, those parts where you did the improv with the voice, and I'm gonna remember those voices. But that was awesome, and I really I should get to play like D&D at some point. I hope I can get involved with. I hear there's some communities that you can kind of sign up for games online.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure if you go to like Google and be like, Google D&D Discord groups or D&D online platforms, I'm sure you'll find spaces where people are like, yeah, searching for an extra player or searching for a game master to run a game.
Yeah.
Or it's like games for new players. You could probably quite easily Google these kind of things and maybe find Reddit threads and subreddits and Discord groups, like I already said. Yeah, I'm sure there's all kinds of places where games are happening. And my background's in theater. And something I learned in
that
theater
explains so much. That explains
you don't need a theatrical background to play D&D, but it does help. But where I was going with that is one of the big lessons I learned in my theater education is if the work isn't there, make it. In other words, if you can't find a group, you've got to be the game master.
There you go.
And then invite some players.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Teni. And I really appreciate, you've given me your time generously today as my mic flies off to the side. Thank you so much for your time.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. If you're new around here, don't forget to subscribe. There's lots more exciting stuff coming in the next few weeks. Thank you so much for joining us today. See you on the next one. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Wolf of Young Street podcast. If you derived value from this podcast, please don't forget to subscribe. I would love to hear from you as well. So please comment your thoughts down below.